Hello, and welcome to today's webinar entitled, How Can We Make It Through the Never-Ending COVID-19 Pandemic, Coping with Uncertainty? My name is Dr. Rochelle Hansen. I am a clinical psychologist and professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina. We're bringing you this presentation as part of the National Mass Violence Victimization Resource Center. Today's objectives are to first describe what we currently know about the COVID-19 pandemic, identify some of the unique issues that COVID has brought to us, talk about some of the mental health concerns and risks associated with the pandemic, and then conclude with some strategies to cope and help you all to manage the uncertainty and constant change that the pandemic has brought. First, I want you to take a moment and think about some of the things you used to love about our pre-COVID lives. There's some pictures here downloaded from Denver, including Empire Field at the Mile High Stadium, downtown Denver, going to restaurants with friends, or perhaps skiing with a group of friends. And then finally, just being able to reach out and hug people that are close to you. All of these things characterized our pre-COVID lives, and all of them have taken a hit over the past year. So since approximately March of 2020, we were all hit by a COVID bomb. And as a result of that, the world pretty much shut down. There were lockdowns and quarantines that impacted every single one of us. So I'd like you to take a moment and jot down what you personally miss most about your life before COVID-19. I hope you all took a moment just to reflect and think about what you miss most from your lives before March of 2020. Here's what we currently know about COVID, and I would like to highlight the importance of relying on reputable resources to get your information, and also to recognize that information has been changing rapidly and that we keep learning something new nearly every day. So go to reliable sources such as the Centers for Disease Control, and where you can download the most current information. So one of the things that we have learned about COVID-19 is that it simply can happen to anyone. If you remember, our former president, Donald Trump, and First Lady Melania tested positive for COVID, and the list goes on. Many familiar faces here, from Bryan Cranston to Dwayne Johnson, Mel Gibson, Jack Nicklaus. All of these individuals tested positive for COVID. And it keeps going, right? Prince George and Jackson Brown and Prince Albert of Monaco, Antonio Banderas. A lot of people have been impacted by COVID and have directly tested positive. So what this says to us is that it can happen to nearly anyone. This is the most recent data that I downloaded from the CDC website to give us just the landscape of where we are right now as of April 13th. We know that there have been over 31 million cases in the United States, that there have been close to 560,000 deaths due to COVID-19. And then if we look specifically at Colorado over the past week, there have been about 480,000 cases to date, with slightly more than 8,000 per 100,000 population. So Colorado is certainly not the highest rate of COVID, but it has been impacted for sure. The second thing we know about COVID is that the risk of more severe illness increases significantly with age. And that's what this chart and these data indicate, is that older individuals are more vulnerable to having a more severe consequence associated with COVID. So they're more likely to have severe illness, and they're more likely to have higher vulnerability due to underlying medical conditions. And knowing that your elderly loved ones may be at risk and you can't always do anything to mitigate this can certainly manage feelings of distress and uncertainty. Another thing we know when we think about the physical impact of COVID on children is that children are less likely to be sick when they have COVID as compared to adults. And some children may not be sick at all. They may be asymptomatic, but they still can spread COVID. And there are a small group of children that do get very sick from COVID, and they're experiencing what's been termed multisystemic inflammatory syndrome in children, or MISC, and that can be fatal. The good news is that the number of children that have been affected by MISC is pretty small. In terms of the impact of COVID on children, who's at the greatest risk? Not surprisingly, babies, those who are younger than age 1, are at highest risk, and children who have some type of underlying illness or health conditions, such as asthma or diabetes or heart disease, or medically complex kids who have multiple kinds of chronic medical conditions, are going to be at higher risk. And we've also learned that obesity is a vulnerability factor for both children as well as adults. We also know that COVID has taken an emotional toll on many people. We know that the impact of COVID on children in terms of emotional distress does vary depending upon the age, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. We also know that while the overall number of visits to an emergency department have decreased, those visits associated with depression or suicidal risks have increased by about 1/3 over the past year. We are hearing, you just open the newspaper every day and we keep hearing about higher rates of suicidal ideation and attempts and higher rates of substance misuse, which is occurring in both adolescents as well as their adult caregivers. What is it about COVID, though, that makes it so unique? And there are two principles that I want to share and talk a little bit about. The first is the fact that COVID is what we call a collective trauma. And secondly, that COVID is a chronic stressor. So it's both this collective trauma, which means it's shared by multiple people across multiple different communities, and it's a chronic stressor just because of the fact that it's been going on for almost 14 months. So what do we mean by a collective trauma? This is based on an article that appeared in the HuffPost on April 9th, 2021, and it does a really nice job of explaining what we mean by collective trauma and how COVID-19 really represents that. So what is a collective trauma, and what about COVID really relates to that? So just a definition from this article: a shared experience of loss and serious emotional disturbance that has touched nearly every citizen of the world in some way. This is an historic event that has changed the way people think and approach their daily lives, and it can carry consequences that are going to continue into the future. So the idea of this pandemic is that it's trauma on a global scale. This is an experience that has been shared across the world, where there have been experiences of loss and distress that have impacted nearly everyone. It has changed how we think and approach our lives, and we know that it's going to have long-term consequences. You know, for example, when will we ever feel comfortable in large social gatherings? When will we be comfortable with human touch, physical touch with others? And we also have to acknowledge that despite the fact that this is a common or collective trauma, we still have to acknowledge that there have been disparities in the impact of COVID. Not everyone has been affected the same. Those who have been involved in the front line, those who've experienced direct loss, those who have prior trauma histories, and those from marginalized populations are just a few examples of those who have been much harder hit by COVID than others. And the other challenges with COVID is that the impact has been worsened by media coverage, which is on 24/7. And also to keep in mind that this is different than an individual trauma, which is happening to one or maybe a very few number of people, and it's typically more acute. One other additional point to bring up about a collective trauma is that because it's happened on such a large scale and to so many people, what individuals tend to do is to minimize the personal impact because they think so many other people have had it worse. So it's not giving yourselves permission to directly confront and acknowledge impact it's had on you, because you look around and you think, wow, other people have been so much more worse affected by this than I have. So it's this worldwide impact that has disrupted everybody's routines and abilities to connect with others. What else makes COVID unique? It's this idea that COVID-19 is a chronic stressor. It presents ongoing uncertainty. We have daily changes in what is risky, what's not, who is at risk, who's not. And sometimes that information can feel inconsistent and conflicting, and that's because it rapidly changes. There also isn't still is not a very clear end date on when this pandemic will be over. The pandemic has resulted in a lot of economic instability across the world. And of course, we all remember that there's been this ongoing kind of changes in just adequacy and availability of basic supplies. Remember when we couldn't get toilet paper and paper towels and Lysol? These were all hot commodities that were in very short supply. These things definitely contribute to the fact that COVID is this ongoing and chronic stressor. We also know that there are certain aspects or features of COVID that have negatively affected children's mental health. For example, school closures or moving to remote learning has resulted in feelings of isolation because of how important and critical peer relationships are for kids in their healthy development. For some children, school was the only place they were getting nutritious meals. And if they were not attending school, then a lot of time they were not getting that nutrition. Again, for some kids, the only way they were getting needed mental health services or academic services was at their school. So if they were no longer at school, or they were still, or kids are still engaged in remote learning, then they're not having access to these important and needed services. Also, importantly, a lot of the stress that has been part of families because of COVID has had a detrimental effect on kids. So unemployment, which brings with it financial stressors, caregivers having to juggle work and childcare responsibilities and also oversee their child's education, food insecurities, mental health impact on caregivers, and heightened risk of maltreatment. All of these things collectively cause a lot of stress within families. We also know that just the impact of the requirements to distance from others has definitely increased distress and anxiety among youth and families and caregivers. And that's why it's really important to differentiate when we talk about physical distancing. This is creating a space, that barrier between you and others in order to reduce and slow down the spread of an infectious disease. That is very different than social distancing, where you're cutting off and disconnecting from interacting with others. And importantly, when we disconnect or we distance ourselves from others, we are at heightened risk for feeling anxious, afraid, for being depressed and bored, for being frustrated and irritable and angry. And also, it does tend to result in marginalizing or stigmatizing certain groups that have been unfairly targeted and blamed for the COVID pandemic. So I do think it's important to make sure that we're clear that what we're encouraging because of COVID is physical distancing, but not social distancing. Who seems to be especially vulnerable to COVID and its adverse impact? Number one are those who have some type of prior trauma exposure, such as exposure to a mass violence incident. The homeless and elderly are also particularly vulnerable. Those with disabilities or prior mental health conditions, and people who are living in more rural or remote communities are particularly vulnerable to being much more adversely impacted by COVID. You also may have heard that there are certain groups that have heightened risks. So for example, there's been higher rates of elder abuse because of COVID, and there have definitely been increased concerns about child abuse. And the interesting thing about child abuse is that there's been this combination of fewer reports, fewer official reports to, for example, Child Protective Services for child abuse, and yet we have a heightened concern. So what's going on here? Well, we know, as I said before, that because of social distancing, families are more isolated and they have less access to social support and needed services. Also, because of the pandemic, there was a reduction in the Child Protective Services workforce and their abilities to, for example, investigate and go to homes, and children are not in school. And the number one reporter of child maltreatment are teachers. So if these kids are not coming to the attention of those who are making the reports, then we are very concerned that these kids are vulnerable and at heightened risk, but they're not being identified. We also know that financial stressors, increased caregiver responsibilities, and homes that are overcrowded because families are coming together in order to try to be safer, that those are all contributing to heightened risk and concerns about kids experiencing violence or abuse in their home. There's other risk factors. For example, children are spending more time online and in social media, which increases risk that they can be victimized. There's also less monitoring because of the increase in caregiver responsibilities. And then just the daily routines for children and caregivers are disrupted. We also know that there's an increase in alcohol and substance abuse by adolescents and their caregivers, which can contribute to more stress and more risk for maltreatment. And then unfortunately, some families have had to make childcare arrangements that perhaps are not ideal because of the fact that they are being pushed and having to make very difficult decisions in order to return to work. And we also know that this constant TV and social media increases distress. So you put all of these things together, we have this combination of COVID-related stressors, less visibility of children due to the fact of quarantining, and combined with a reduction in workforce capacity for child protective services. Together, these things will contribute to fewer children being detected, and yet the stressors make us more concerned that there's family violence or that children are at risk for maltreatment. So the important part of this webinar really is to start to think about what can you do to help manage this stress and ongoing uncertainty that's been associated with the pandemic. Probably the most critical message that I'm trying to convey is that each of us have to figure out what we can and what we cannot control and place our attention, our focus on what we can control. So I'd like you just to take a moment and think about your daily life and figure out what is it about your daily life that you do have control over. As it pertains to the COVID pandemic, here are some things that we have control over. Number one, you can make a decision to get vaccinated. Number two, you can again make that decision to wear a mask when you're around others. You can maintain that physical distance, the recommended 6 feet from others, and you can wash your hands frequently. These are all things that have been recommended since the onset of the pandemic as ways to reduce our personal risk. And each of those you have some choice and control over. And if we look at the most recent data in terms of vaccinations across the United States, we can see that there have been almost 200,000 doses of vaccines administered to date, and approximately 30% of the population is fully vaccinated at this point. So I would argue that we're moving in the right direction by people making that personal choice to take control of this aspect of their lives to mitigate the adverse impact of COVID and to help us to return to some type of pre-COVID life. So I want you to take a moment and I want you to think, what are you most concerned about? What has been especially difficult for you over the past year? And what about COVID and this past year has made you feel the most uncertain? And just giving you a chance to pause and jot down your response. So one of my favorite memes that I've seen related to COVID is this one. And this is an example of an ongoing stressor that many caregivers have felt. You know, parents, how's that homeschool going? You lied, my kids are not a joy to have in class, right? I said before that parents are being asked to not only juggle their ongoing work and home responsibilities, but they're also being asked to teach their children. And not only is it difficult to treat your own children, but the other piece of this is it increases that feeling of uncertainty, and your confidence can take a hit, especially if you have a child who's difficult to teach, not an easy learner, or you have an older child who perhaps is taking courses that are above your own knowledge. This is going to help to contribute to feeling uncertain of your own abilities, and it just increases stressors that caregivers are already feeling. So this is a really interesting article that talks a lot about the stress that kids are feeling, and it highlights what's going on for our middle school, our tweens. And this was an article that appeared in the New York Times on April 13th, 2021. And I'm just going to share with you a few of the key points from this article. This is again reflecting and talking about kids in that early adolescent or middle school period. We have learned over the years that early adolescence is one of those critical periods for development. There's a lot of rapid, very extensive changes that are going on in the brain, including puberty. And then socially, middle school kids have this increased awareness of their social status and where they fit among their peers. They want approval from others, and that makes things very stressful for them. And also, very normally, developmentally, they are separating from their caregivers, trying to figure out their identity, and they want social interactions with their peers. And yet, this is exactly the opposite of the experiences of many of these children during the past year, right? They want to be with their peers, and instead they're forced at home with their caregivers. So this has been a very challenging time, particularly for this age group, and that makes them especially vulnerable during COVID. As one example, if we look at data that was put out by the CDC in 2020, when we look at 2020 versus 2019, the proportion of mental health related visits to the emergency department, and I'm going to just highlight the children again, ages 12 to 17, increased over that year by 31%. That just highlights that this age group is experiencing a disproportionate amount of depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation. However, don't want to be Debbie Downer, because the real important take home from this is that this age group, because of all of those rapid brain changes, is also incredibly adaptive and resilient. And there are things that we as caregivers, important adults in these children's lives, can do to make sure that they can adapt and be resilient despite a lot of the stresses that they've experienced. Here are some things that help. Number one is, as parents, as caregivers, as adults, we can help our children connect to at least one good friend. The data show that if kids can maintain a social connectedness with at least one peer, that their vulnerability and their distress levels are going to be much less. Secondly, is highlighting the importance of adults who can help kids cope with the stress and hardship. And what this means is that we have to make sure as parents that we are keeping it together. And probably, again, another take-home point is that as adults, we have to stop referring to this as a lost year. And what that means is that we have to balance two perceptions that probably on surface seem very contradictory. And the first is acknowledging with our teens that, yes, this has been a difficult, challenging year, but not necessarily a completely lost year, because secondly, we are resilient and we can get through this together. So all of the publicity and the social media coverage that keeps saying kids have lost a year academically, they've lost a year socially. Yes, it's been challenging. Yes, there have been some setbacks, but there is nothing to indicate that this has to be permanent for our teens. And that's on us. We have to stop conveying the message that this year has been a total loss. So what can we do? What can every adult do? Number one is to take care of yourself. And I can't say that enough. As adults, we must take care of ourselves in order to be helpful and useful for the children in our lives. My favorite way of thinking about this is that when you get on an airplane and the flight attendant does a demonstration of using oxygen, they always say, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you put it on your child, because if you can't breathe, you can't help anyone else breathe. Same analogy that I want you to apply to your daily life. If you don't take care of yourself first, you are of no use and are completely unable to take care of your child. So what are some tips for you as caregivers? Again, I won't stop saying the importance of relying on reputable sources of information to learn more about COVID, as it does change pretty rapidly. Make sure you're taking time for fun for yourself, doing something that brings joy to your life. In terms of interacting with your child, make sure that you're providing information that is age appropriate and leave time for questions. So if you're having discussions around the dinner table and you're sharing information with your children in, again, age appropriate ways, make sure you pause, check in, and leave time for your child to ask questions. And if you don't know the answers, it's okay to say so. Just also come back and get information when you have it. Also, watch your own reactions. This is particularly important for our younger children who look to us for advice. And they look to us to see how are you doing, because that's going to help them to determine how they are doing. Also importantly, particularly with our teens, is to be honest about your uncertainty. It's okay to say, you know what? I am feeling kind of anxious. I'm not certain about everything, but here are some things we could do together to address that. And importantly, find ways to connect with other people, whether it's phone calls, using social media, or getting on Zoom and doing FaceTime. So one of the things personally that my family has done is we started doing weekly Zoom calls with the whole family. And we now affectionately refer to this as Zoomily. And every Sunday at 5 o'clock, we try to get whoever's available, my adult children, my parents, my sister and brother and their families, even a cat or a dog may appear on one of these Zoomilies. And this has been our way over the past year to stay in touch with each other, to stay in contact, because that connectedness is so important. Also, something else to keep in mind, I mentioned earlier, is that the way children react and how they cope with COVID-19 does vary depending upon their age and developmental level. So for example, for younger children, what we want to do is to provide lots of reassurance. We want to give them an opportunity to express whatever they're feeling through play and telling stories. It may be helpful, at least in the short term, to have some changes in sleeping arrangements, but I would really encourage you to not do that too long term because that can create some difficulties down the line. Very, very important is to make sure that you're maintaining regular routines, such as engaging in comfortable activities right before bedtime. So for example, that bath time, story time, same sleep time is incredibly important for young children who thrive on routine. And for these young kids, they don't need any exposure to media. So I would completely avoid having the TV on 24/7 for the young kids. School-age children need slightly different things. They need to have scheduled play dates with their friends and opportunities to connect with peers, whether that's through phone or internet, or you're scheduling driveway play dates. Also having an opportunity for regular daily exercise and getting outside if children particularly are still doing remote schooling, having a set routine for their day. And it's still important as adults to set limits. We can't just have a free-for-all. We need to have that routine because kids do thrive on routine. And in this age group, we want to limit, not necessarily completely avoid all social media, but we do want to limit it. Teens, some of the things that I mentioned before are important to highlight here. Number one is to validate and normalize their feelings of anxiety. Make sure that they are also using reliable sources of information about COVID. Make sure that you also share with them, same thing that I've talked with you about, to differentiate between things that they can do something about, things they can control, versus things they can do nothing about and cannot control. Help them to identify ways to maintain those social connections with their peers, but I would not advocate giving unlimited screen time. Help your teen to try something new. And importantly, this is probably counterintuitive and not something we think about, but all of us, particularly our teens, need to have the opportunity to feel their feelings, recognize that they have experienced loss and they're grieving for things that perhaps they didn't get that others did. So for example, a lot of teens over the last year weren't able to attend major life events. So they couldn't go to their proms. Maybe they couldn't go to their graduation. They couldn't go to the big play that they typically would put on. So we have to remember and recognize and acknowledge their losses and give them a place to grieve and feel sad. It is worth repeating that we must manage our own stress and take time for self-care. Maintain boundaries. Go in front of the mirror and practice saying out loud, "No." It's okay to delegate and to not take on new responsibilities, particularly now. Avoid overload. And again, take care of yourself, finding a balance in your life. That means taking time to find joy, doing fun things, and also maintaining those connections. There's a theme here, right? Maintain social connections with others. And I know you've heard this before, but it continues to be really good advice that we have to engage in healthy coping strategies, things like yoga and mindfulness, relaxation techniques, if it's important to you and helps you reaching out in your faith and spirituality. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight when it might be important to seek professional help for yourself or others. If anxiety and stress have become so overwhelming that they are interfering with your ability to sleep, that you or you see in loved ones extreme withdrawal from other people, if you're seeing either a loss or an increase in appetite, these are all signs to seek out professional help. And if you're relying on alcohol or drugs and it's become excessive, that's another indicator to seek out professional help. And then finally, if you or anyone you know seems to be having a safety risk, please, please do reach out and get that professional help. And then the final thing I really want to highlight for everyone is that each of us as individuals and families have to figure out what our new normal is going to be. What is life going to look like as we move into that peri-pandemic and post-pandemic phases? If you've encouraged or incurred any kind of financial losses, then you have to figure out what are the steps to help deal with that. If you're making decisions around whether you're going to, for example, wear a mask or not wear a mask, attend social gatherings or not, and are there going to be any stigmas associated with those situations that you're going to have to grapple with? And each of us have to make decisions about what kind of, quote, normal routines we're going to return to. Are we going to feel comfortable? And when are we going to feel comfortable going back to restaurants? Are you going to feel comfortable going to a public gym, going on public transportation? Do you feel comfortable going to a hair salon and getting your hair done? Do you feel comfortable going back full time to school? And you hear people talk about reentry fear, which is a real thing, right? This past year has brought significant changes to our lives, and each of us have to make personal and family decisions about what new normal is going to look like. And my final take-home points for all of you is you have to get what you need. And I'm going to leave you with one final quote by Dalai Lama, who says it better than I ever could. There are only 2 days in the year that nothing can be done. One is called yesterday, and one is called tomorrow. So today is the day to love, believe, do, and mostly love. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.